states and radical terrorist organizations continue to pose challenges to international order and undermine peace and stability. We have made progress. We've made progress in the fight to destroy ISIS. That's clear. We've made progress in halting the Taliban in Afghanistan. But the broader security environment still remains unsettled. The strategic resolve of our nation, the United States, is being challenged, and our alliance is tested in ways we haven't faced in many, many decades. In this environment, the United States Army remains the world's premier ground force, the foundation of America's joint force. And the Army, as part of the joint force, along with our allies and partners, must be ready to win, must be ready to fight tonight, and readiness remains our #1 priority. But we simultaneously have to build the right force for the future, while always taking care of our soldiers and the families and the great Army civilians, as they all remain our most valuable asset. But I want to be clear. I want to be unambiguous. I want to be clear to those who try to oppose the United States. I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm. I want to be clear to those around the world who want to destroy our way of life and that of our allies and friends. The United States military, despite all our challenges, despite our op-tempo, despite everything we've been doing, will stop you and we will beat you harder than you've ever been beaten before. Make no mistake about that. And the United States Army is America's combat force of decision. And when the political leadership of the United States decides to deploy its Army, and when we show up on your turf, then you know the game's for real, and the stakes are for keeps. And the other thing you know is you're going to lose. You will lose to the American Army. Make no mistake about it. We can now, and we will remain in the future, retain the capability to rapidly deploy, and we will destroy any enemy, anywhere, anytime. So I stand here today, and I caution the enemies of America who doubt or misread our capability. Many enemies have grossly underestimated the United States and its people in the past. They've underestimated our national resolve. They've underestimated our capability, our skill, and our combat power. And each made a fatal choice, which ended with their enrollment in the dustbin of history. The same will be true of any enemy that makes that mistake today or tomorrow. But while we are ready now, and will remain so in the future, we are also facing tough strategic choices, and we are being increasingly challenged with very capable potential adversaries, clearly acting in opposition of our interests. It's our aim to deter war, but if deterrence fails, we as an army, we as a nation, must be prepared to fight. And the pain of preparation is always less than the pain of regret. Never forget that deterrence is expensive, and the only thing more expensive than maintaining capable, ready forces is actually fighting a war. And the only thing more expensive than fighting and winning a war is fighting and losing a war. And our job as an army, our contract with the American people and the People's Army, we make this contract with all American citizens, that we, the United States military, we, the United States Army, will never lose a war. And yes, as Secretary Fanning said just yesterday, you have to pay for it. And the costs of victory, it's very expensive. It costs a lot of money, a lot of treasure, and a lot of blood. So we find ourselves in a difficult place. Our readiness to fight a war against a high-end, near-peer adversary has eroded in the last 15 years, as we fought and continue to fight against terrorists and guerrillas in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. We were highly successful in ripping apart Saddam's army in 1991, ejecting him from Kuwait, and we shattered his army again in 2003. Similarly, we destroyed the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in very short order. But we had difficulty consolidating gains and adapting to a counterinsurgency fight. We eventually made the necessary changes. The Army mortgaged our future. We mortgaged our future readiness, our modernization, in order to adapt and sustain the fights in Afghanistan and Iraq. We reduced the size of our forces significantly since the end of the Cold War and the so-called peace dividend, and we significantly reduced our Army modernization budget by over 75% in the last decade and 30% in the last 3 to 4 years alone. While we focused on the CT and the coin fight, other countries, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, went to school on us. They closely watched how we fought in 91 and 03. They studied our doctrine, our tactics, our equipment, our organization, our training, and our leadership. And in turn, they revised their own doctrines, and they are rapidly modernizing their militaries today to avoid our strengths in hopes of defeating us at some point in the future. Recently, a senior Russian official, ambassador to the United Kingdom, Alexander Karamenko, he said, quote, "The established world order is undergoing a foundational shakeup with the Crimea, Ukraine, and Brexit." He went on to call for the dismantling of NATO and the European Union. And he said, quote, "Russia can now fight a conventional war in Europe and win. Russia is the only country that will remain relevant forever. Any other country is dispensable, and that includes the United States. We are endgame now," end quote. He said that all just 30 days ago. Bluster? Hubris? Bravado? Or does he mean what he says? Does he believe it? And more importantly, do the leaders in the Kremlin believe it? Well, history tells us to be careful. It's always wise to believe foreign leaders' declaratory policy, as most nations tend to telegraph their strategic intentions. So, we've taken a number of steps over the last year to increase our readiness in the total Army, our regular Army, our Guard, and our Reserve. We've increased the number of BCT going through high-end, full-spectrum warfighting rotations at the combat training centers at Polk and at the NTC. 2 of these rotations are Guard brigades, and we're about to double that for the National Guard to 4 annually. And these additional rotations are improving readiness throughout the Army, current readiness, but also improving our future readiness by creating a pool of leaders that are now developing multiple rotations, hitting the sled over and over again in the most challenging training environment against a world-class OPFOR that realistically portrays the current and projected threat environment. We've also initiated our regular Army and National Guard Associated Units pilot program, which is strengthening the bonds between the active and National Guard components, increasing the readiness of the total Army. And we are seriously considering increasing the number of annual training days in selected National Guard units so they will be able to more rapidly deploy in the event of conflict. We've also significantly increased our combined arms live fire programs, both at home station, the combat training centers, and we've also increased the frequency of our mech and armored gunneries, improved our artillery skills to deliver mass, timely, and accurate indirect fires. We've re-energized our forcible entry airborne and air assault capabilities and renewed our rapid deployment capability with increased emergency deployment readiness exercises, both in CONUS and overseas. In short, our readiness is steadily improving across the entire formation of the United States Army. But our progress is slow, and it's going to take consistent, predictable funding and much more time and effort to reach the levels we need to in order to provide our political leadership capable options that adequately reduce current risk to both mission and force. And we are also planning to field, train, advise, and assist brigades and multi-domain task forces in our force structure in order to sustain our efforts to defeat terrorists by, with, and through regional partners and free up conventional brigade combat teams to regain much-needed training time to hone their skills the higher end of warfare. Another critical effort to improve readiness is our acquisition reform, being led by Secretary Fanning. This is a top priority for us. We must do better. We can do better. We must exploit our science and technology to create options for a very challenging future battlefield and have an acquisition system that's up to the task, an acquisition system that can deliver on time and on budget. We cannot afford acquisition failures. We cannot afford systems that are late to need, and we must not send tomorrow's soldiers into harm's way with yesterday's equipment. As Secretary Fanning discussed yesterday, many of the initiatives we are putting in place, like the revised Army requirements process and the Army Rapid Capabilities Office, are just but two examples. In the near term, our equipment modernization strategy will continue to focus on critical capability areas like lethality protection, the Mission Command Network, integrated air and missile defense, rotary wing and ground mobility, emerging threats, and a rapid development of our offensive and defensive cyber capabilities as part of a joint force-wide effort. In the near term, the Army will continue to invest in incremental improvements with the highest operational return on existing systems and build new systems only by exception. So readiness for combat, readiness to fight tonight, remains our #1 priority, but the future is actually going to come. The future is going to be here pretty soon, and sooner than many of us may like. So we must look over the hill. We must look past the challenging demands of the present and ensure that our future Army is equally ready to fight and win. We must work now to anticipate the broad nature of the challenges we face, the threats we will confront, and the options we will need to present to our leadership. Which future force decisions must we make in our own time, and which can we defer to those leaders that follow us? Over the past year, led by TRADOC, we have dedicated significant time and resources to thinking about drivers of change in the future operational environment, how warfare is changing and how we must adapt our doctrine, our organization's equipment, training, and leader development. We must also take a humility pill here, eat a little humble pie, and recognize that the future is not really knowable in any kind of detail. And frankly, we're not going to get it right. But as the great British historian Michael Howard said, you don't have to get it right. You just have to get it less wrong than your enemy. And it's my belief that here we are on the cusp of a fundamental change in the character of warfare, and specifically ground warfare. The nature of warfare is not going to change. It's immutable. It's still a political act, war is, a decision by humans to impose their political will on their opponent by the use of violence. Wars will still be characterized by chance and fog and friction, and it will always be a dynamic interaction of competing human wills, and its cause will likely still adhere to Thucydides' famous analysis of fear, pride, and interest. But the character of war, how wars are fought, where wars are fought, with what weapons and technologies, organizations, and doctrines. In short, the ways and means of war is, in my view, about to undergo fundamental, profound, and significant change. That change will not happen on a certain day or even in a year. In fact, we're undergoing that change right now as we sit here, and we've been in the midst of it for some time. That change is evolutionary, not revolutionary, but it is no less profound. And I suspect that the organizations and weapons and doctrines of land armies between 2025 and 2050, in that quarter-century period of time, will be fundamentally different than what we see today and will likely have in the few years ahead. Think of the difference between the smoothbore musket and the rifle, or the rifle and the machine gun. The difference between muscle power of foot soldiers and horse cavalry and the machine power of tanks, trucks, and airplanes. Think of the shift from guidons and flags and drums to the telegraph, telephone, and radio. Think of observation to the limits of the human eye to the introduction of the radar. The shift from sail to steel and steam the shift from dumb bombs to smart bombs. A soldier of 1865 could not imagine a soldier of 1918, even less so a GI of 1945 or a grunt of 1965. That was pure science fiction to the Yank or Johnny Reb. Rapid change, however, has become increasingly compressed, especially in the last 150 years. And I would submit to you that those of us today will find it difficult to recognize the battlefield of 2035, let alone 2050. It is that kind of profound shift, that shift from 1865 to 1918, or even to 1945, that I am talking about, that is ongoing right now. And it is the result of a series of geopolitical, economic, societal, and technological change, some of long duration and some relatively recent, that is driving this change, but I believe we are definitely going to see it. And history offers some caution here. In all of the past cases of significant change in the character of war, the elements were all present prior to the war, but few, if any, ever realized their significance. And the armies that did see the change and adapt accordingly usually prevailed, at least at the beginnings of wars. All the elements of World War I were visible in the Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, the Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War, but very few understood their profound impact in the summer of 1914 as Europe slid over the abyss into a devastating world war, the consequences of which we still feel today. A few years after the war to end all wars, all the technologies of armor, mechanization, wheeled vehicles, airplanes, and radio, they were all available to all the great powers in the 1920s and 30s. But only Germany combined them in a concept of war in a way that led to incredible battlefield success from 1939 to 1942, when their opponents rebounded and realized and massed their industrial might and adjusted their doctrines, organizations, and equipment under the pressure of war to eventually destroy the Nazi Reich. And the failure to see, the failure to connect those dots pre-World War I, the failure to see and the failure to connect those dots in the 1920s and 30s cost 100 million lives, a huge amount of blood, and years of human suffering. It is our task, the task of you and I, the task of us, both civilian and military, to do better, to see the trends, and to get the future less wrong than our enemies. So what do we think is shaping that future out to about 2050? Unfortunately, war between nation states, in my view, is very unlikely to remain relegated to the history books. Although constrained by a variety of factors, such as the incredible financial cost and human cost of war, the incredible lethality of modern weapons, various international regimes and organizations designed and dedicated to keep the peace, it is my firm belief, and I hope I am wrong, but I believe that war is not yet purged from the inventory of human behavior. Although there is clearly a diffusion of power in the international system with the rise of various non-state actors, a nation-state is still the fundamental and most important element in the international system, as it has been since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And each nation-state is still considered sovereign, although those boundaries are clearly under pressure. Most importantly, there is no single higher power in the international system with the legitimacy, authority, and power to enforce the global order, as most functioning nation-states routinely do within their own boundaries. There is clearly growing instability as many countries are proving fragile and certainly do not control the widespread use of organized violence within their own borders. But it's also clear that the nation-state remains the basic actor in the system and is likely to remain so to at least 2050. And the most important core national interest of any state is to survive. Survive in a system of international anarchy. Survive in a system with no higher order. And absent a higher authority, each nation must dedicate itself to secure itself. And because there is no higher authority, and because security is the primal interest of each state, conflict between nation states is virtually guaranteed at some point. There's been some huge geopolitical shifts in history. The fall of Rome in 476, the rise of Western Europe in the 1500s, the rise of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, the dominance of the United States in the immediate post-World War II era, the collapse of Soviet Russia. And today we are in the middle of yet another major geopolitical change. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. essentially was the unchallenged global military, political, and economic power. And we were experiencing what some have labeled a unipolar moment. That is changing, and changing fast. The United States is under significant challenge in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. In Europe, we see a revanchist Russia, who has modernized their military and pursued an aggressive foreign policy in Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine, and elsewhere. In Asia, we are in the third decade of the biggest global economic shift in 5 centuries, with the world economic center of gravity moving from a North Atlantic to the North Pacific, and resulting in a rapidly rising China as a great power with a revisionist foreign policy backed up with an increasingly capable military. Also in Asia, we are faced with a rogue North Korea that is rapidly increasing their missile and deliverable nuclear weapons capabilities. In the Middle East and parts of Africa, we see instability from terrorism in many places, and likely to continue as the very concept of the nation state comes under intense pressure, while we also still see a revolutionary Iran carrying out various malign activities to assert its regional dominance. In short, the global order since the end of World War II, and for sure since the end of the Cold War, is under significant stress in areas of vital interest to the United States of America. And we know from history that unipolar and bipolar international systems tend to be very stable. But we also know that multipolar systems are inherently prone to competition, confrontation, instability, and state-on-state wars. We are entering that multipolar future, and in fact, we've probably been in it for a few years. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, in his now famous Litany of Doom testimony, said that, quote, "Unpredictable instability is the new normal. We are seeing the highest rate of instability since at least 1992, and that Russia sees itself in direct confrontation with the West, that China continues its robust military modernization program directly aimed at what they consider to be U.S. strengths, with training exercises unprecedented in scope, scale, and complexity." And then he concludes that in his 50 years in the intelligence business, I cannot recall a more diverse array of challenges and crises that we confront as we do today. John Brennan, the head of the CIA, echoed similar comments, as well as many respected civilian foreign policy and security analysts. In addition to the international order undergoing significant stress and fundamental change, we are witnessing significant demographic change, with mass migrations for both security and economic reasons, as people flee war-torn regions to survive while others move from resource or job-scarce areas in search of a better life. For whatever reason, the bottom line is that massive amounts of people in unprecedented numbers are moving from one country or one region to another, which is amplifying destabilizing effects. One of the most militarily significant mass migration is the movement of people to cities, which has really been going on for well over a century. 75% of Americans lived in rural areas 100 years ago, while today that number is completely inversed, with almost 70% of Americans living in urban areas. Globally, we are witnessing urbanization on a massive scale. In 1950, only 2 cities, New York and Tokyo, had populations of over 10 million people. Today, there are 38, and it's projected by 2050 there will likely be over 50 megacities of over 10 million inhabitants, with 70% of the world's estimated 8 billion people living in urban areas. If war is politics by other means, and politics is all about people and power, then future wars are almost certainly going to be fought mostly in cities, which has significant implications for the military. Climate change is yet another likely significant driver of future instability and has been long in development. But we know that the seas are rising. We know that now. And most of the world's population lives near the water's edge. There is also significant impact on various resources, not the least of which are the basic elements of human life, i.e. food and water. We are witnessing the disappearance of freshwater lakes and rivers in many parts of the globe, like Lake Chad, for example, projected to disappear by mid-century. With it goes a major water source for Central Africa, which is already in turmoil for many other reasons. The possibility of devastating effects of resource conflicts in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia is very, very real. Lastly, the maturity of various technologies that either exist today or in advanced stages of development, when combined, are likely to change that very character of war just all by themselves. Information technology exploded in the mid to late 1800s and has been on an upward curve for the last century and a half. Today's internet, iPhones, big data, and soon-to-be Internet of Things are either here or just over the horizon. And it has become cheap to the point where there are way more interneted communication devices today than there are people. In just a few years, it's expected there'll be 50 billion internet-connected devices in a world of 6 to 7 billion people. The ubiquitous effect is that almost no matter where you go in the world today, it's observable from some device. The ability to surveil, to see, to communicate, it is levels never before seen in human history. Almost everyone and everything is a potential ISR platform capable of transmitting real-time information that, if properly analyzed, can be useful intelligence which can significantly help or seriously hinder military decision-making and operations. And the proliferation of information technologies is rapidly diffusing power once held by nation-states and potentially accelerates instability, as we witnessed during the Arab Spring. And with the advances of information technology, we are now seeing an entire new domain of warfare in the form of cyber. This is an area of truly dramatic change with very significant military implications. Serious cyber capability is right now being developed and employed by major nation-states, and it is entirely possible to inflict widespread damage on an opposing country's economy or military solely through the use of cyber tools. We see this in our daily lives now with hackers and cybercrime and imposters and the like. But that is a relatively minor nuisance compared to the resources of an advanced nation-state like Russia, China, or even North Korea and Iran can bring to bear. The predecessor of cyber is, of course, electronic warfare, and electronic warfare capabilities have been advanced rapidly over the last 20 years, and they have reached unprecedented levels that can significantly degrade and shut down friendly communication networks. We're also seeing the rapid development of robotics, especially in the commercial sector. Many analysts are projecting a significant impact on future jobs and potential elimination of entire job categories in areas like transportation and service industries. Some predict an entire overhaul in the type of work humans will do in the future and expect robots to be pervasive in our everyday life within just a decade. Of course, we already use robots in the military in a limited way, with unmanned aerial vehicles as most commonly known. But the scope of robots in military operations is not yet widespread, and that is likely to change in the very near future, as unmanned fighter bombers, unmanned surface, and subsurface naval vessels come online. And we are likely, very likely, to see the increased use of robots in ground operations as the technology matures. In fact, my Russian counterpart has publicly set an objective that 1/3 of the Russian military will be robots by 2020. That's in 4 years. He may not actually achieve that goal, but his intent and his direction is clear. We are also in the midst of major change in lethality and the proliferation of precision munitions to most nations in varying degrees of quality and quantity. Lethality against fixed and rotary wing aircraft has also advanced significantly in the last few decades, so airspace can be denied even to the most sophisticated and expensive aircraft. Land and sea-launched ballistic missiles have proliferated throughout the world, and land, air, or sea-launched cruise missiles have done the same to deny either the maritime or air domains. What was once the exclusive province of the United States military is now available to most nation-states with the money and will to acquire them. There are a wide variety of technologies developing in synthetic fuels, 3D manufacturing, medicine, human engineering, and enhancement, all of which will likely have significant military implications as well. And finally, there is the mother of all technologies, artificial intelligence, where machines are actually developing the capacity to learn and to reason. There's lots of ethical and moral issues associated with all these technologies, and especially in their application to warfare, but there's no doubt in my mind that the combination of geopolitical, societal, natural, economic, and technological change is rapidly converging in time and space and will likely result in the most significant and profound change in the character of war we have ever witnessed throughout all of recorded history. And whatever overmatch we enjoyed militarily for the last 70 years is closing quickly, and the United States will be, in fact, we already are, challenged in every domain of warfare: space, cyber, maritime, air, and of course land. So what are the logical implications, and what must we do to prevail as an army in future combat? The first thing is to understand the basic likely outlines of that future world. Although we cannot determine the exact environment we will have in 2030 or 40 or 50 or beyond, we can, through rigorous analysis, determine what the world is likely to look like in its broad outlines. There will surely be lots of surprises along the way to the future, but we can get the basics about right to develop the forces and the weapons and the equipment that we need to protect our great nation. And then we have to place the big bets in research and development in science and technology, while simultaneously conducting legitimate and genuine experiments with our force designs and our doctrine. And this means to us, the Army, that every assumption we hold, every claim, every assertion, every single one of them must be challenged. War tends to slaughter the sacred cows of tradition, of consensus, of groupthink and myopia. The next war will be no different. Those of us, or those nation-states that stubbornly cling to the past, will lose. They will lose that war, and they will lose it in a big way. We should think of nothing in the past as sacred except the concept of victory. The structure and organization of our Army, both operational and institutional, may change drastically, and we must be open-minded to that change. We may not have divisions or corps or tanks or Bradleys. We don't know yet. But we are on a serious and deliberate campaign of learning to figure it out. And I can tell you, we need to figure it out pretty fast. And it's better for us to slaughter our sacred cows ourselves rather than lose a war because we are too hidebound to think the unthinkable. At this point, we can say a few things we've learned over the last year of study that we've done intensely about future high-end war between nation-states or great powers. And the first, not surprisingly, is that it will be highly lethal, very highly lethal unlike anything our Army has experienced, at least since World War II. With sensors everywhere, the probability of being seen is very high. And as always, if you can be seen, you will be hit, and you will be hit fast with precision or dumb munitions. But either way, you'll be dead. So that means just to survive, our formations, whatever the wire diagram looks like, will likely have to be small. They will have to move constantly. They will have to aggregate and disaggregate rapidly. They'll have to employ every known technique of cover and concealment. In a future battlefield, if you stay in one place for longer than 2 or 3 hours, you will be dead. That obviously places demands on human endurance, on equipment. But I can guarantee you the days of Victory Base, the days of Bagram, or other static locations for comfort or command and control will not exist on a future battlefield against a high-end threat. That fact requires a significant change in our current methods of thinking, training, and fighting. Additionally, the battlefield will be highly complex, almost certainly in dense urban areas and against an elusive, ambiguous enemy that combines terrorism and guerrilla warfare alongside conventional capabilities mixed with large civilian populations. Our Army, for the last 241 years, for 2.5 centuries, has fought mostly in rural areas, rolling plains, and open deserts. Yes, we were in Baghdad, we were in Hue, we were in Aachen, but for the most part, it was rural areas, rolling plains, or open deserts. In the future, we're going to have to optimize ourselves for urban combat. That fact, and I believe it to be a fact, has huge implications on intelligence collections, vehicle and weapons design and development, logistics, communication systems, and mission command. Can tanks elevate their guns to near vertical? Can UAVs fly down alleyways? Can radios communicate through multi-story buildings? How do we develop intelligence inside underground areas of a city? How do units and people move and maneuver? How do you do target discrimination and identify friend from foe from non-combatant? All of that and more will be extraordinarily difficult. Army operations in complex, densely populated urban terrain is the toughest and bloodiest form of combat, and it will become the norm, not the exception, in the future. The battlefield will also be nonlinear and compartmented, and units will have non-contiguous battle space with significant geographical separation between friendly forces. This type of battlefield will place a very high premium on independent, relatively small formations that are highly lethal and linked to very long-range precision fires. Our formations will come under enemy fixed-wing, rotary-wing, UAV, and missile attack on a routine basis. Dominance of the air by the United States Air Force, which the Army has enjoyed since the Normandy landings in 1944, will no longer be a luxury that we can assume in the next war. That means our units are going to have to be combined arms, multi-domain capable. We will still have to fight and destroy land-based enemy units and seize terrain. But the Army, yes, the Army, we're going to sink ships. And we're definitely going to have to dominate the airspace above our units from hostile air or missile attack. This is going to require sophisticated air defense capabilities that are not currently in our unit inventories. In fact, just this morning, a few hours ago, we began to roll out our multi-domain battle concept, where all of our Army will maneuver in all of the domains to gain temporal advantage, enable the joint force freedom of action to seize the initiative. And we will employ our great mobility. We will employ our advantage in fires, both long range and close. And we will conduct cross-domain fires, and land forces will, both horizontally and vertically, integrate all of the joint force in all of the domains. And it will be armies that will be central to winning future wars. Because the enemy anti-access and area denial capabilities and their development over the last decade Land-based forces now are going to have to penetrate denied areas in order to facilitate air and naval forces. This is the exact opposite of what we have done for the last 70 years, where air and naval forces have enabled ground forces. To do that, we're going to have to develop ground capabilities that can see and shoot at very long range, far in excess of what is available today. The sustainment challenges will be significant. Life will almost certainly be extremely austere. Water, chow, ammo, fuel, maintenance, and medical support will be about all that we should plan for. Pizza Huts, fast food, male showers, and any other comfort items should not be expected on this battlefield, at least not as a matter of routine. And our lines of communication will for sure be contested and probably denied. Being surrounded will become the norm, the routine, the life of a unit in combat. In short, learning to be comfortable with being seriously miserable every single minute of every day will have to become a way of life for an army on the battlefield that I see coming. The ability of units to produce or purify their own water and locally manufacture their own spare parts with 3D printing may become a necessity. And if the lines of communication can be open and resupply convoys, will likely be autonomous robots or remotely controlled convoys, because they will be the only acceptable risk method of supply that we can get to forward troops. Our strategic lines of communication and ports of embarkation and debarkation will absolutely be challenged. We will have to fight just to get to the fight, and we will have to rediscover the art of port openings under pressure, at scale, and relearn the skills of strategic sea and air rapid deployment to introduce combat power before the strategic ports are closed. And Mission Command will be one of our toughest challenges. Crises will unfold rapidly, compressing decision cycles and response times. Ambiguous actors, intense information wars, and cutting-edge technologies are going to confuse situational understanding. Information overload is going to be a problem for every echelon, and separating the wheat from the chaff will place a premium on information management systems. The sheer volume and speed of conflicting information can easily bring decision-making to a screeching halt, and of course, that'll only be a problem if the electronic systems even work. Our Army, in fact our military, and that of our adversaries are highly dependent on reliable, secure electronic systems, not only for communication, but for fires, navigation, and other functions. There's a high probability, a certainty really, that anything electronic will come under cyber or EW attack, and that we will be operating routinely in a partially or significantly degraded environment. That means we must invest in hardening our systems, and equally important, train on the techniques of operating with limited electronics. That will be a shocker for all of us, but it will be a reality. We might actually have to read a paper map again and learn how to use a lensatic compass. More significantly, we will have to seriously train and prepare ourselves for decentralized, independent operations based on mission command to execute the higher commander's visualization and intent without ever having actual contact with our higher headquarters for extended periods of time. Imagine not being able to talk to the Pentagon or the White House. That will be reality. This method will have to become a reality in everything we do, a basic MO, a basic modus operandi, and not just a buzzword in briefings and classrooms. And that brings me to people, our most valuable asset and arguably our most significant asymmetric advantage inherent in the American military and the United States Army. For we come from a society of improvisers, a society of tinkerers, innovators, problem solvers, techno-savvy at an early age, and independence of action comes natural to all Americans. Self-starting initiative, disdain of boundaries and rules, nonlinear critical thinking, and aggressive will to win, coupled with an eternal optimism to overcome all obstacles to achieve the objective. All of that is hardwired in the national DNA of an American soldier. Our leader development programs, officer and NCO schooling and training, and individual soldier training is going to have to amp up in order to leverage the already present inherent qualities in all of our soldiers, from private to general. In the absence of supervision, the willingness to disobey specific orders to achieve the intended purpose, the willingness to take risk to meet the intent, the acceptance of failure and practice in order to learn from experimentation. These are all going to have to be elevated in the pantheon of leader traits. And finally, there is character. On a non-contiguous, non-linear battlefield with little higher command supervision and maximum decentralization, we have to develop leaders who have incredible character under intense pressure, leaders who can be trusted to do the right thing when no one is watching except the enemy and the news media, leaders who make the right moral and ethical choice in the most emotionally charged environment humans can ever face, the environment of ground combat. And those leaders will not only be responsible and empowered, but they will be accountable for both their results they achieve and the values they hold. So in short, the next 25 years are not going to be like the last 10, and they're not going to be like the last 25. The accumulating challenges we face and the changing character of war is unlike anything our current force has ever experienced in intensity and lethality. So we are developing those capabilities while sustaining our CT and COIN capabilities. And our potential adversaries are already moving out, so we really have no choice. It's a tall order, for sure, to operationalize and execute multi-domain trans-regional battle, to project power into contested theaters, to project power into all domains, to fight inside denied territory, to fight in urban areas that are highly populated with all of its complexities, and to survive and to win on an intensely lethal and distributed battlefield, and to create leaders and soldiers that can prevail. Tough, yes, but impossible? Absolutely not. We're the United States Army, and we don't shrink from tall orders. We're the United States Army, and our enemies need to know that these colors don't run from tough fights. We will adapt and we will evolve our current force, but in the end, we will win. That much I can tell our enemies that they can take it to the bank. And I am not speaking only to our Army, for our Army does not win wars on its own. Nations, not armies, go to war. So we need the support of industry. We need the support of our civil leaders. We need the support of Congress. We cannot do this alone. We have our allies, we have our joint partners, but we've got to have the entire nation. In the last year, we focused on current readiness and applied time and money to building it, and it's improving, and it will remain our top priority. And now, we have to define and build the Army of the future, and we're heading in the right direction on both fronts. The process that we developed to think critically and deliberately is working, and it's guiding our investments and decisions. But our nation expects us to be ready and to win. So we're going to have to get this less wrong than whoever opposes us. And we're going to have to do that in order to pass to the next generation the gifts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that have been so granted to us. You know, 100 years of relative peace separated the Napoleonic Wars from the abyss of World War I, when nations and empires marched off to their destruction, blind to the changes in war that existed before the battle was ever joined. We are now over 70 years since the last great power war that was the most destructive war in human history, a war that both my parents fought in. A noted classics historian recently wrote that he sees an increase in nationalism and regional arms races, unresolved territorial claims, ethnic and sectarian disputes, and a return to 18th century balance of power politics with spheres of influence. And he concluded that there's a light breeze in the air, and it may turn into a storm. And he concluded at the end of his essay that a hard rain is about to fall. So let us, here, now, and in the present, Let us commit to not march into that abyss, blind to the changes. Let us for once in our own history, not be unprepared for the next first battle. Let us have the vision to change and to prevent the war from happening in the first place. But if it does happen,